It begins, not in the execution chamber, but in a small bedroom in Florida in May 1979. A room barely big enough for a child's bed, a stuffed toy, and the kind of safety only parents believe they can guarantee. A 6-year-old girl slept there, her tiny body curled under the covers, while her mother and father moved in another room, trusting that a locked door and a thin window screen were enough to keep evil out. But that night, evil had a name. 20-year-old Marine on leave, Bryan Frederick Jennings, watched that house and made a choice that would carve a wound into Florida's memory for nearly half a century. He removed the screen from her bedroom window, lifted her from her bed, and carried her into the dark. By the time the sun rose, a child was missing, a family was broken, and a community was thrust into a nightmare it would never fully wake up from as hours turned into panic. Neighbors and officers fanned out with flashlights calling her name, hoping to find her lost, not gone. But later that day, her body was found in a canal, violated, injured, and drowned. The kind of scene that makes seasoned detectives stop talking on the drive home and makes parents everywhere check their children twice before turning out the lights. Evidence led back to Jennings with unnerving precision. Shoe prints in the dirt that matched his, fingerprints on the window where the screen had been removed, clothes and hair still wet, and witnesses who had noticed a man matching his description near the home. He was arrested within hours, not some shadowy mystery that would haunt cold case files forever, but a living, breathing man who had calmly walked back into the world after destroying a life. The case that unfolded was described by prosecutors as one of the most devastating they had ever handled. In the courtroom, the details weren't just read, they were felt. Jurors cried. Reporters needed breaks. Some officers who'd seen far too much in their careers struggled to keep their composure as they listened to how a child had been taken, assaulted, and left to die in a muddy channel of water. The jury didn't deliberate long. Jennings was convicted and sentenced to death. Not once, but twice his death sentence was handed down, and twice it was reversed on appeal, not because the facts changed, not because he was suddenly innocent, but because the machinery of the justice system required more time, more procedure, more technical perfection. In 1986, after a third trial, he received the death penalty again, and still, he did not die. He remained in a strange limbo known too well in American law, condemned, but not yet confronted by the sentence. As the girls' parents aged, as their hair grayed, as their bodies began to wear down, the man who took their daughter's life continued to wake up behind bars, file appeals, and turn calendar pages. Grief doesn't keep time the way the courts do. For them, every hearing, every delay, every stay was a reminder that their child's final moments had been decisive and brutal, while accountability for the man who ended her life moved at the speed of paperwork. Years turned into decades. Governors changed. Laws shifted. Executions across the United States rose and fell with political tides and public opinion. But one reality remained. Somewhere in Florida State Prison, inmate Bryan Frederick Jennings was still alive, while the girl he killed remained forever 6 years old. Some of her relatives died before they ever saw justice completed. Others kept going back to the courts, year after year, refusing to let her name be swallowed by case numbers and legal language. This wasn't about revenge for them. It was about closure, not about hatred, but about finally being able to look back at that night in 1979 and know the story had an end. As the decades rolled on, Florida's death chamber saw many people pass through, but Jennings's case always felt like a ghost lingering at the edges of the state's conscience. When Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant, it wasn't just another signature. It was the final stroke in a story that had stretched almost half a century. Florida was on track to carry out a record number of executions in a single year, more than any governor had overseen since the death penalty was reinstated in the 1970s. For some, that number is a political talking point. For one family, it was a promise finally being kept. On November 13th, 2025, The day of his execution, Jennings woke up in Florida State Prison, knowing that the system he'd spent decades testing had finally run out of space for him. He was 66 now, a far cry from the 20-year-old Marine who'd once climbed through a little girl's bedroom window. Witnesses described him as calm, almost detached, as if he had finally reached the end of a road he'd known was waiting from the moment he was first sentenced. He spoke with a spiritual advisor. He made small talk with officers. His final appeals failed. The US Supreme Court declined to intervene. His lawyers argued he had gone months without proper legal counsel before his warrant was signed, but the courts did not stop the clock. As evening approached, he was led into the execution chamber, a place designed to be clinical, unshakable, and final. On the other side of the glass, members of the victim's family sat quietly, hands intertwined, each one carrying a gravity of memory that no one else in that building could fully understand. When officials asked Jennings if he had a final statement, he answered with a single clear word: no. No apology, no declaration, no attempt to rewrite history. In his last breath, he lay down on the gurney as prison staff secured the straps across his arms and chest. A needle pierced his skin. The 3-drug protocol, sedative, paralytic, and heart-stopping agent, began its silent, irreversible work. Witnesses said his chest rose sharply a few times. His arms twitched. His body shuddered briefly as the chemicals moved through his veins. And then, slowly, he went still. At 6:20 p.m., the same state that had once searched desperately for a missing child now pronounced the man who killed her dead. Outside, Florida marked its 16th execution of the year, a record in the modern era. Inside, for one family, numbers didn't matter. Only this moment did. And that is where the story shifts. Not to Jennings, but to the people who had waited almost their entire adult lives for this day. For them, justice was not a word carved into a courtroom wall. It was the long, exhausting journey through hearings, reversals, appeals, and headlines that sometimes forgot the name of the little girl at the center of it all. It was empty chairs, at birthdays and holidays. It was decades of imagining her life as it could have been. School pictures, graduations, a family of her own, while knowing that all of that had been stolen in a single violent night. When they left the prison that evening, they did not leave rejoicing. There were no cheers. There was only a different kind of silence, the kind that comes after a storm finally burns itself out. The pain was still there. The loss was permanent. But the waiting was over. In the larger story of American executions, Bryan Frederick Jennings becomes another line in a chart, another entry in a long debate over the death penalty, its morality, its failures, its power. His death came in the same week another condemned man, Tremaine Wood in Oklahoma, was spared at the last moment by a governor's decision, and just before South Carolina prepared to execute Stephen Bryant by firing squad for his own trail of killings. Some see these events as proof that the system is too harsh. Others see them as proof that it has been too slow. But whatever side of the debate people fall on, one unshakable fact remains. A 6-year-old girl was taken from her bed one night in 1979, and for 46 years, her family has lived inside the shadow of that crime. On the evening of November 13th, 2025, when the doctor checked for a pulse and found none, that shadow finally began to lift. Somewhere in Florida, behind a quiet door, her family sat together that night in a room that had seen countless tears. And for the first time in almost 5 decades, they could say the words they had carried in their hearts like a distant hope. It's over. Not because their pain ended, not because their love for her dimmed, but because the story that started in a small bedroom with a stolen child had finally reached its last line. And in that rare, fragile silence that followed, the state that once searched for a missing girl and later housed her killer, finally allowed one family something they had been denied for 46 long years, a measure of peace.